I want to spend one thing for a guy by the name of Randy Rhoads. Because if I hadn't met Randy Rhoads, I don't think I'd be sitting here now. My wife Sharon saved my life and my grandbabies and my baby.
On July 5th, 2025, in Birmingham, the very place where it all began, Ozzy Osbourne stepped onto the stage for the last time. No more jumping, no more screaming. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, his frail frame wrapped in a black suit, eyes hidden behind his familiar sunglasses. But as the microphone was lifted to him, the crowd fell silent, then erupted in a frenzy of wild cheers. He didn't need to sing. He just needed to stand there, to be there. Because for those who had lived through the wildest era of rock, the name Ozzy wasn't just music. It was a singing nightmare, a symbol of survival, a wound that turned into legacy. The show, titled Back to the Beginning, was never promoted as a farewell. But everything about it suggested otherwise. And exactly 17 days later, Ozzy Osbourne passed away at his home in Buckinghamshire, in the arms of Sharon and their children. No oxygen tubes, no machines. Just the breeze brushing through the garden, a dog barking in the distance, and a pair of headphones still playing She Loves You by the Beatles, the song that once saved his life in prison at age 17. Ozzy's death didn't shock the world. He had been gravely ill for years, facing Parkinson's disease, spinal infections, serious falls, and countless age-related complications. But precisely because death came so gently, like a whisper, it made the question even more haunting. What does a man who lived like a storm leave behind when the wind finally stops? And who has the courage to hold on to that scream in a world increasingly used to silence? This story isn't just about death. It is a final reckoning of love, of mistakes, of songs screamed into darkness, and of the unexpected light that lingers after the shadows depart. Because Ozzy Osbourne wasn't a star, he was an echo. And the question is, how far will that echo carry now that the voice behind it has gone quiet? The man who lived like a singing scar. Nothing in Ozzy Osbourne's childhood suggested he would become a legend. On the contrary, every sign pointed to him becoming another sad statistic: poverty, illiteracy, illness, crime, and perhaps an early death, like so many nameless young men in post-war Birmingham. His real name was John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948 in the working-class neighborhood of Aston, where the sounds of trains and coal smoke were the only soundtrack. His father was a metal worker. His mother worked night shifts at a car factory. 6 children crammed into a damp gray brick house. From a young age, Ozzy was labeled stupid, unable to read, do math, or remember lessons. He would later be diagnosed with dyslexia, but in the 1950s, no one cared. Teachers beat him, classmates mocked him, and his parents were too busy to notice their son was sinking into shame. He attempted suicide at age 11, after witnessing a neighborhood boy drown. He feared death, but feared being forgotten even more. As a teenager, Ozzy took on odd jobs: plumber's assistant, slaughterhouse worker, where the smell of fresh blood haunted him for years. No job held him for long, no future appeared. And then, at 17, he was arrested for stealing petty goods and sent to jail because his family couldn't afford the fine. It was in that dark cell, in the silence of despair, that he heard She Loves You by the Beatles on the radio. The melody made him cry. "I didn't know music could do that," he later recalled. "It made me want to live one more day." When released, he made a decision. If music could save him, then he would use music to scream for all those who had never been heard. And so, with a few friends, Ozzy started a band, originally called Earth, later renamed Black Sabbath. None of them knew music theory. They didn't start with harmonies, but with noise, screams, guitars that sounded like war. Ozzy didn't know how to sing high or handle technique. He only knew how to yell, with a nasal, guttural voice that sounded like someone being strangled. But the audience heard truth in it. because he sang like someone who had lived in the dark. And people believed him because he had been there, not just told stories about it. That voice, rough, imperfect, full of cracks, became the anthem of a generation of outcasts, youths who fell through the cracks, American soldiers returning from war, addicts, the mentally ill, those who no longer believed in God or society. Ozzy didn't save them, but he gave them a sound to die with, or in some cases to live for. No one thought that voice would survive to age 30, but it did. And it roared through millions of records, hundreds of tours, dozens of scandals, and thousands of souls who had nearly given up, but suddenly saw themselves in that scream. Maybe that's why, in the end, Ozzy left behind so much, because once he had nothing but a scream, and he turned it into a universe. Career. The thin line between life and death. Ozzy Osbourne didn't build a career. He wrestled with it. He didn't climb the ladder of fame. He crawled up from the wreckage of his own broken self. When Black Sabbath released their debut album in 1970, critics mocked it. They called the music the moaning of drunken laborers, a failed fusion of blues and thunder. But the youth heard something else, an acknowledgement of fears no one had ever dared name. Black Sabbath didn't sing about love or sunshine. They sang about death, war, addiction, the devil, madness, and being lost. And Ozzy, with a suffocating voice like a man teetering at the edge, became the soul of that pain. From the very beginning, his career hovered between glory and self-destruction. Black Sabbath's tours were chaos, drugs, alcohol, blood, destruction, and some of the most iconic performances in heavy metal history. But by the late 70s, that chaos consumed him. Ozzy became too unmanageable, and in 1979, the band fired him from the very group he had founded. That was the first death, and then he came back. Sharon Osbourne, the daughter of manager Don Arden, was the one who reached out and pulled Ozzy from the bottom. With a mix of cold resolve and real affection, Sharon forced him to start over. She introduced him to Randy Rhoads, a young guitar prodigy who breathed new life into Ozzy's music. The Blizzard of Oz album, 1980, was a spectacular resurrection. The track Crazy Train became an anthem. Ozzy was reborn, not as the ghost of Sabbath, but as a solo icon with a haunting voice, wild performances, and bizarre fashion. But fate wouldn't let him rest. In 1982, Randy Rhoads died in a horrific plane crash at just 25 years old. The accident happened in front of Ozzy, in the middle of a tour, the second death. This time, he nearly didn't recover. The years that followed were a downward spiral. Ozzy drowned in drugs, alcohol, and depression. At one point, he tried to strangle Sharon during a psychotic episode and was arrested. Yet somehow, he survived. The album No More Tears, 1991, felt like a confession and a release, with the title track carrying a suffocatingly dark melody. When the world thought Ozzy was just a relic of the old metal days, he returned to television. In 2002, The Osbournes premiered, a reality show chronicling the chaotic, substance-laced life of the Osbourne family. Viewers saw fumbling Ozzy, struggling to walk, barely hearing, mumbling, lost, but still strangely funny and bizarrely endearing. The show became a global phenomenon. For the first time ever, a rock legend survived by exposing his own deterioration to the public. Ozzy could no longer sing well, couldn't stay on stage long, couldn't remember interview questions. But he still existed, as a symbol of defiance for those who had once stood at the brink, looked down, and chosen to laugh at it. The question was no longer, is he still alive? It became, when someone who lived to scream finally falls silent, what remains? Material legacy, an empire, screamed into existence from silence. Ozzy Osbourne once had nothing, except for a scream no one wanted to hear. But that very scream gave birth to an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not built on control, but on chaos, not meticulously planned, but driven by the survival instincts of a man once so desperate he had to steal clothes just to have something to wear. At the time of his death, Ozzy's estimated net worth stood at around $220 million, a staggering figure for someone who once couldn't read a contract. But in his world, music wasn't just art. It was ownership and the right to tell your own story. As early as the 1990s, Sharon Osbourne quietly restructured the entire financial framework surrounding her husband's career. Together, they regained control over his personal music catalog and shares in Black Sabbath, something few rockers of his era ever achieved. Every time Paranoid or Crazy Train played on the radio, a stream of royalties flowed into a trust in Ozzy's name, and from there to his family. But music was just the beginning. When MTV aired the Osbournes in the early 2000s, Ozzy, once a violent, blood-soaked rock icon, suddenly became the bumbling dad shuffling around two swearing kids and a wife who cursed better than he did. And strangely, the public loved it. The show became a cultural phenomenon, and Ozzy's image rights were revalued, not on stage but in the marketplace. They began trademarking. Prince of Darkness became a protected brand. His screaming face appeared on t-shirts, scented candles, comic books, single-origin coffee, energy drink cans, and even dog leashes. Each product brought in passive income. Each image became a new cog in the commercial machine called Osbourne. Outwardly, Ozzy lived simply. He enjoyed listening to the Beatles in the garden, collected cars just for their looks, and kept his Buckinghamshire home as a place to disappear when needed. But the asset structure was far more complex. Investment funds in the US, UK, and Ireland, holding companies that managed his intellectual property and image rights, long-term contracts allowing for his likeness to be recreated in documentaries, video games, and even AI-generated vocals. In his later years, when he no longer performed, Ozzy still signed endorsement deals with blockchain music platforms and was rumored to have invested in NFT projects aimed at immortalizing his personal brand, though no financial reports have confirmed this. Some die-hard fans believe he left Sharon and the kids a digital treasure vault, a repository of his compositions, letters, demos, studio notes, and even personal journals, all digitized for future generations to explore. And then, there's the kind of legacy no one can put a price on, the spiritual inheritance, the power of a scream that could span generations, a face once branded as demonic that came to symbolize resilience. Just as he once said, "I'm the last survivor of my generation, not because I was stronger, but because I never figured out how to die at the right time." What he left behind wasn't just wealth. It was an empire built from the scream of someone who was once forced into silence. The will and the heirs. While he was still alive, Ozzy Osbourne once mumbled to the press that he had died in 1982, after Randy Rhoads' death. Everything after that was just an extended chapter of someone who didn't know how to bow out. But when real death finally came on July 22, 2025, he was prepared, with a will far less chaotic than the life he had lived. In the testament finalized in 2024, Ozzy granted full control of his estate to Sharon, the wife who had saved his life more than once. According to terms disclosed by legal offices in Los Angeles and London, Sharon was given lifetime authority over the assets, including the power to decide on any future transfer. One insider noted, Ozzy believed that if not for Sharon, there wouldn't be anything worth leaving behind. Most of the estate would eventually go to their 3 children, Kelly, Jack, and Amy, but not immediately. Kelly and Jack, the 2 most publicly linked to the Osbournes, were appointed as co-executors of the will, set to inherit equal shares after Sharon's passing. Amy, who had always chosen a life away from the spotlight, would receive her share through a separate trust. According to the published documents, that trust would release funds gradually until she turned 50, as a way to protect her from the very industry her father lived in and nearly died from. However, the will was vague, almost silent, regarding the 3 children from Ozzy's first marriage, Jessica, Louis, and Elliot. No clause explicitly confirmed their inheritance rights, prompting a flurry of speculation from the British and American press. One rumor suggested that Jessica had refused to participate in family events, causing long-standing tension and resulting in her exclusion from the inheritance plan. Yet a source close to the family in Beverly Hills revealed they weren't excluded, but what they received was private, cash, real estate held under proxy, or assets outside the main trust. The most moving and most speculated rumor centers around a handwritten letter Ozzy reportedly left for Sharon and the children. An unofficial photo of it circulated on fan forums, quoting its final line as, "The royalties from my music must keep feeding hope. No one comes back from hell, but at least we can sing so others don't have to go there." Though unverified, those words, whether real or imagined, eerily reflect the way Ozzy lived, both as a tormented soul and a gatekeeper of hell who knew how to tell its stories. And perhaps he didn't leave a will just to distribute wealth, but to ensure that his scream would continue, at the right place, for the right people, and in the exact moment it was needed most. Charitable giving. Ozzy Osbourne was never the type of artist to preach morality or wear philanthropy as a badge to polish his image. He once bluntly said, "I'm not a good person. I'm a survivor." Yet perhaps because he had lived so close to death, he understood deeply the value of a second chance. Over $190 million, that was the total raised from back to the beginning. The final concert held just 17 days before his death. No one expected that night to be not just his last performance, but also the most vivid testament of his legacy, written in sound and gratitude. Every cent went to 3 causes he personally selected. Cure Parkinson's, as a tribute to the doctors who helped him fight the disease until the end. Birmingham Children's Hospital, which he had quietly visited without cameras or press. And Acorns Children's Hospice, a sanctuary for children who no longer had much time. But that was just the surface. Fans and media are now speculating about the unofficial parts of Ozzy's will. Rumors that he had earmarked tens of millions more from personal accounts for 4 deeply personal causes, ones that reflected the man himself, not the icon the world labeled him as. First, a mental health care foundation, because Ozzy once said, "The scariest thing isn't death, it's when your mind turns on you." Second, a fund for aging and struggling musicians, dedicated to artists who were once idols but ended up in obscurity, like old bandmates he had seen fade away, lacking royalties or even basic health insurance. Third, a free music school for children in the working-class neighborhoods of Birmingham, a full circle back to where his journey began. And finally, an animal rescue fund with a special clause Ozzy requested. Take extra care of stray dogs and cats during the winter. There is no official paperwork confirming these donations, only stories shared by friends, managers, and scribbled notes from backstage. But one particular line continues to circulate on social media as part of the myth. "I was once the stray dog left behind. If I can, let my music feed the others who still need to survive." It may just be a poetic line created by a fan, but if you truly understand Ozzy Osbourne, the man who lived his whole life on the edge between light and darkness, then you'll know. It might be the most honest thing he ever wrote. Controversies and looming fault lines. When Ozzy Osbourne closed his eyes for the final time on July 22, 2025, everything seemed to be neatly in place. A carefully drafted will, clearly named heirs, a structured trust designed to prevent disputes, and a family, at least on the surface, still holding hands. But behind this polished exterior, quiet gaps began to widen, like the very silences that had once punctuated Ozzy's scream-filled life. In the official will released by the Osbourne family's legal team, Sharon was granted full ownership of Ozzy's estate, music rights, and image licensing for the remainder of her life. After her passing, the estate would be divided equally among their 3 children, Kelly, Jack, and Amy. However, the other 3 children, Jessica and Lewis, Ozzy's biological children from his first marriage to Thelma Riley, and Elliot, Thelma's son, whom Ozzy helped raise, were entirely absent from the published documents. There wasn't a single line acknowledging them as heirs, beneficiaries, or even as part of his past. To outsiders, this may appear as a simple legal decision, but for longtime fans, especially those who followed Ozzy's journey from the beginning, it felt like a gaping emotional void. Ozzy had publicly expressed regret over his first marriage and his failings as a father. In a 2010 interview, he admitted, "I was terrible to my first children. I have no excuse, only guilt." That's why the omission of those names led many to ask, was this a deliberate exclusion or part of a private arrangement with discreet settlements left outside official paperwork? A source formerly involved in estate law noted, "It's entirely possible Ozzy left off the record assets, cash, business shares, or real estate, transferred directly to Sharon with personal instructions on how to divide them, to avoid taxes and public scrutiny." Some even believe Ozzy wrote a personal letter to Jessica, the daughter he had virtually no relationship with for over 3 decades. The contents of that letter remain unknown, but British media have claimed it exists, allegedly kept in Sharon's private safe. Beyond the question of who gets what came a darker one. Who decides how the legacy lives on? For now, the answer is Sharon Osbourne, the woman who stood by Ozzy for nearly 45 years, pulled him out of addiction, turned their lives into a hit TV show, and took charge of nearly every financial decision, has now become the heart and brain behind Ozzy's estate. Emotionally, that makes sense. Commercially, it raises red flags. Veteran fans have already voiced concern that Ozzy might be branded in crude ways, through shallow tribute shows, surface-level documentaries, hologram tours, or NFT products that betray the raw, anarchic spirit of the rock he lived for. One deepfake video that circulated after his funeral sparked such outrage that Sharon was forced to publicly deny involvement. Fan groups have begun calling for the formation of an Ozzy Legacy Oversight Committee, consisting of family members, artist representatives, fans, and music historians, to ensure that any future projects honor the true spirit of his legacy, rather than turn it into a bottomless cash machine. So far, there's been no formal lawsuit from Jessica, Lewis, or their representatives, but estate lawyers in California predict that legal action is likely within the next 6 to 12 months. The issue may not be about money, but about symbolism. If the first children feel erased from history, not just financially but in terms of dignity, they're fully entitled to demand clarity, one expert explained, especially when their names weren't even mentioned in the family's public statements of mourning. Ozzy once said in an interview, "I don't want to cause trouble after I'm dead, but I don't think I'll be able to help it." And maybe he was right. Not because he sought conflict, but because his life, even in death, remains a scream that was never fully understood. When a screamer chooses to whisper goodbye, Ozzy Osbourne's final day had no stage lights, no screams, no curtain calls. He didn't wear the crown of the Metal Emperor, nor the cloak tied to his Prince of Darkness persona. There was only an old man, sitting quietly in the garden behind his home in Buckinghamshire, wearing headphones, eyes closed, listening to "She Loves You" by the Beatles, the song that had once saved him at 17, in a freezing prison cell. No one knows what he thought in that moment, perhaps of his parents, of Thelma, his first wife, whom he had hurt, of the children he once lost his way from, of Randy Rhoads, the friend who died in a crash that left him silent for years, or perhaps of Sharon, the woman who saved him, nearly died by his hands and ultimately became the one he loved until his very last breath. Ozzy's death wasn't like any ending in rock, not explosive like Kurt Cobain, not mysterious like Brian Jones, not radiant like Freddie Mercury. It was quiet, private, almost gentle. A departure so serene it felt surreal for a man who had once ripped his throat raw screaming about hell and madness. But maybe that was the only way someone like Ozzy could say goodbye, through a whispered breath after a lifetime of screaming. He didn't leave behind grand manifestos. He didn't carve his name into monuments. What he left were screams that had never been named, distorted sounds, harmonized pain, memories you only realize you've lived with once the music stops. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't a legend because he was flawless. He was a legend because he was real, raw in darkness, teetering on edges, caught between madness and salvation. And when he left, that death didn't close a chapter in rock history. It opened a question. Will what he left behind live on the way he lived? That's not a question for the history books, it's a question for us, for those who once heard him, screamed with him, and now stand silently before the void that bears his name. If a song by Ozzy ever made you stop, cry, or simply live a little differently for a few minutes, share it below. Every memory is a note he never got to hear, but we, the ones still here, can let them play again. One more time. What do you remember most about Ozzy Osbourne? Leave a farewell or just a lyric as a way to keep him alive among us.